Hello friends, this is Sanjeev Kaushik and I trade for a living. In this video, I want to talk about the US debt ceiling and should you as an investor or a trader be concerned about it, especially considering the fact that we have the deadline approaching in October, which is next month, when US must raise its debt ceiling. Otherwise, there's a risk that US may default on its debt obligation, that is some of the debt repayments that it has to make in October and of course in the coming months. Of course, it's a unique nation. No other nation has to actually raise the debt ceiling by going through a political process. If they want to really run the higher budget deficit, they can pretty much do that by borrowing extra. They don't have to go through this process. But US is unique. However, this is nothing more than a formality, but sometimes it leads to additional volatility and uncertainties in the stock markets, as well as in the way the country has been run. So first of all, what's the difference between a debt and a budget deficit? A debt is nothing but the debt on the government. In this case, the debt on the US government, right? And this debt may be expiring in, say, 5 years, 10 years, and even 50 years. We don't bother about that. But it's the debt, it's the combined debt on the US government. A budget deficit is more of an yearly balance sheet. That is, how much a government owes to its lenders and how much the government earns by ways of revenues, by ways of selling its strategic assets, and there can be many other streams that the governments can rely upon to generate revenue for themselves, right? Currently, the debt ceiling of US stands at 101% of its GDP. In other words, US can borrow up to 101% of its current yearly production. You may argue that this is perhaps the highest ever in the history of US, but that would be incorrect. You see, back in the times of World War II, the US debt was at 106% of its GDP. Of course, the GDP also was very small comparatively, but it's not the all-time high number, that is the 101% of debt of its GDP. But there are estimates at the same time that say that by the end of this decade, that is by 2030, US would have its debt equivalent to 106% of its GDP. Of course, the GDP would rise as well, but at the same time, the debt on US government would also rise. And even more mind-boggling is the fact that this ratio of debt to GDP would actually go all the way up to 195% in the year 2050. So almost double anything and everything that the US produces in its country in 1 year. Almost twice that is what US would owe to its lenders by the year 2050. So this is about the debt and budget deficits, right? Now let's talk about the political game that is going on. You see, we individuals, and in this case, mainly the US population, they know how a home budget is run, right? So you know that too much of debt is bad for any household. So you should always limit your spending in order to make sure that you're able to service all your debt. And you should, of course, always borrow within your limits. That's what the households usually focus at. But the governments are run a little differently. Especially US government, which can print its own dollars and then repay, right? But the households, of course, cannot do that. And therefore, there are arguments made that if US really needs to fund its infrastructure requirements or to maybe push a lot of people above the middle class, lower middle class, and even poverty, then US needs to spend all this money and they need to run this higher budget deficit. And as a result, they need to raise more money by way of debt. And of course, this debt ceiling consequently needs to be raised. That's an argument that usually Democrats give. And Republicans, on the other hand, are in the favor of running a government a little more prudently and making sure that the budget deficits and the debt ceilings are not breached. Now, whether this debt ceiling should be raised or not, I don't know. I'm not an expert. I want to talk to you about how this may impact me as a trader and me as an investor. All right? Now, Republicans are saying that Democrats have all the majority in both the houses, and they can pretty much pass this resolution of raising the debt ceiling by themselves. They do not need the support from Republicans. And this is true factually. But Democrats, on the other hand, including some of their prominent leaders all the way up to the President Biden, have actually spoken in media saying that they expect Republicans to come in the support of this particular debt raising bill so that they don't have to do it all by themselves, even though they can do it all by themselves, right? But why? Why Democrats need the support from Republicans? The answer is very simple. If the Democrats would have done it all by themselves, and they can pretty much do that, then Republicans can go to the people of the USA and say, look at this government. They're being extremely irresponsible in the way they're running this nation. Because if we keep raising the debt of the country, at the end of the day, our coming generations are the ones who will have to pay for this particular debt. And we as Republicans do not support such irresponsible way of running a government. And that's why we are not going to support the raising of debt ceiling. But ultimately, the US will pass this resolution with or without the support from Republicans. So yes, towards the end of all this political drama, we would see that the US has increased its debt ceiling and the volatility would come down. But before that happens, there are every possibilities that the political rift between the two would actually have a ripple effect on the US stock markets, and therefore we may see some enhanced volatility. Now, whether you're going to use this enhanced volatility to your favor or you want to sit out of the market is by all means your personal choice. But I want to lay out the fact around the debt ceiling and budget deficits and how it actually works. That's all that I wanted to cover in this video. Let me know, you guys, how you found this video. I'll really appreciate your comments underneath. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.